All right.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Eric Goldstein. I'm the director of the TAM Institute for Jewish Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Goldwasser Lecture in Jewish Studies and the Arts here at Emory University. It's my real pleasure tonight to welcome Professor Tony Michels, who I'll introduce in a minute. First, I want to explain that this lecture is part of a symposium that the TAM Institute is hosting this week, marking the 150th anniversary of the Yiddish press in the United States. And we have gathered a group of 9 scholars, people, both faculty members from universities around the country and also some international scholars, as well as graduate students who are working on various aspects of the history of the Yiddish press in the United States. And this year, 2020, marks the 150th anniversary of the founding of the very first Yiddish periodical in the United States. So we're using this opportunity to have a scholarly symposium over 2 days where each of us are presenting papers as a kind of workshop and commenting on them and giving each other feedback. And so as a public segment of this program, we have invited Professor Michels to deliver a public lecture on a topic related to the symposium. Before I officially introduce Professor Michels, I want to say what a great pleasure it is for me personally to have him here, both at the symposium and as our guest tonight. Tony and I have known each other. I think I figured out earlier that it's been 28 years since we first attended what I believe was for each of us our first Association for Jewish Studies conference in Boston. And we were both new graduate students and presenting papers for the first time. And we got to know each other. And since then, we have continued our scholarly interchanges and meeting at conferences and welcoming each other to our respective universities to make presentations. So it's always a pleasure to have the chance to have him here at Emory and to continue to learn from him after 28 years. Tony Michels is the George L. Mosse Professor of American Jewish History, and he's also the director of the Mosse Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he is the author of a, now I would consider a classic book in the field of American Jewish history called A Fire in Their Hearts, Yiddish Socialists in New York. It was published by Harvard University Press. The bio I have here says 2009, but I believe it was originally published in 2005, if I'm not mistaken. And it is a necessary book for anyone interested in American Jewish history and specifically in the history of East European Jewish immigrants in the United States, Yiddish culture, Jewish politics, and the history of New York and Jews, in the country more broadly. Tony also is the editor of a book called Jewish Radicals, a documentary history, published in 2012 by NYU Press. And he is the co-editor, along with Michels of Volume 8 of the Cambridge History of Judaism, which covers the modern period 1815 to 2000, published, of course, by Cambridge University Press in 2017. And Tony is hard at work now on a almost completed project looking at the impact of the Russian Revolution on American Jewish life. And tonight we're very lucky to hear from him on a topic related to the history of the Yiddish press. His title is For the Better Jewish Reader, The Birth of Yiddish Magazines in America. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand the virtual podium over to Tony Michels.
Eric, thank you for that generous introduction and the invitation. I really wish we were in person on campus at Emory because not only is it close to that delicatessen that I love so much, the General Muir, I think it's called, but there's no substitute for talking in person. And so much of my thinking about the Yiddish press and and much else in American Jewish history has been formed through conversations with you, as you said, over the last almost 3 decades. It's a shame we have to do it virtually, but I know we'll be in person soon. So thank you again to you and the TAM Institute for.
Let me just interrupt for 1 second and explain to everyone that I'm going, while Tony speaks, I'm going to disappear for a while, but I will come back when he concludes, and I'll conduct a question and answer session in which you can use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. And even if while he's speaking, if you want to start entering questions in there, you may do that. So I'll be back for that segment when Tony's finished.
Okay. All right, thanks, Eric. Okay, as is well known, the Yiddish press was one of the most vibrant and influential institutions in the lives of immigrant Jews. During its heyday between the 1890s and 1940s, Yiddish readers enjoyed a remarkable variety of publications to choose from mass circulation daily newspapers such as the legendary Vorwärts, to humor magazines such as Der Kibitzer, to political organs like Der Zionist, the Zionists, to specialized trade journals such as Der Jiddischer Bäcker, the Jewish baker, and Der Shadchan, the matchmaker, and much more. This evening, I'll discuss a little known but important chapter in the history of the Yiddish press, and that's the rise of Yiddish magazines. And what I'll focus on specifically are magazines that, depending on the case, dedicated themselves to educating their readers, advancing Yiddish culture, or providing a forum for serious discussion of politics, society, and Jewish communal affairs, in certain instances, all within the pages of a single publication. There was no single uniform type of Yiddish magazine, but all the ones I'll discuss this evening shared at least one thing in common, and that is their aspiration to reach what the editors and publishers considered to be, quote, the better or more intelligent or serious readers. All those terms were used more or less interchangeably. The better reader, the more intelligent reader, and the serious reader were words that are often, or terms often used, often invoked to describe these magazines and the audiences they wish to reach. I'll start with some definition. What do those terms mean? It's impossible to know with precision who exactly those terms applied to, because they were used, the same terms were used differently by different writers and editors and publishers at different points in time. But the better, intelligent, serious readers seems to have been a mix of the following from what I'm able to glean from the way the terms have been used over a period of time. So the terms, the better reader, serious reader, intelligent reader, refers to, it seems to me, several different types. They're just types. One is the self-educated worker. That's to say, a worker who has had no formal schooling or no formal secular schooling, but took it upon himself or herself to acquire secular education. And in New York and Chicago and some other cities, there were a lot of opportunities to do that. I would also include in this category of the better Yiddish reader, self-educated small businessmen, people who might have been at one time workers, maybe or maybe not, but in any case had become self-employed. This type was often not recognized officially. And that's because a lot of almost all the people I'm talking about, almost all the editors and publishers who put these magazines out were socialists of some kind. So they never identified the self-employed or small businessmen as a type they wished to reach, educate, or what have you. The type didn't exist as an important social type for the socialists who put out these magazines, but I know that they existed as readers. And readers of these magazines that I'll be discussing. Another type that fell under this category of the serious or better reader were what were called sometimes semi-intellectuals. And those were people who had received some level of secular formal schooling, and perhaps had earned a high school degree or the equivalent to it, but not necessarily, and almost never a college degree. This might include, for instance, a former yeshiva student, someone who studied in the yeshiva in the old country, dropped out at some point, and so had some formal Jewish education, maybe quite a bit of formal Jewish education, but not secular education that might have been acquired along the way on their own, or someone who might have done a few years of a secondary school and then was left on his or her own. So the semi-intellectuals also belong to this category. And then there were intellectuals. These terms intellectuals were also not used with precision. Sometimes semi-intellectuals were simply called intellectuals or called themselves that. But intellectuals, and let's say the purest form or the highest form, were college educated, often professionals such as doctors, dentists, and lawyers. Sometimes those people came to the United States with a degree, and in many other instances, however, they earned those degrees in the United States. So again, college-educated professionals were certainly part of this Yiddish, this better, higher Yiddish reading audience. And in a very, very few instances, there were individuals who had advanced degrees, PhDs in one thing or another. They were also grouped in with the intellectuals. Now, some of these now everyone I just described, the self-educated worker, the self-educated businessman, the semi-intellectual, the intellectual, all these people, all these people who belong to these different categories, or at least some of them, I should say, also were writers. So intellectuals were also writers as well as readers. There were self-educated workers that advanced to the point that they were also writers and sometimes recognized as intellectuals in as much as they wrote and trafficked in ideas, even if they didn't have a degree and achieved a high level of formal education. So that's one thing to keep in mind about the audience. The audience included writers, and some of the writers even addressed themselves mainly to intellectuals in certain kind of publications and we'll see at least one example of that. All right. So overall then, the community of better writers and readers, as I just described it, was relatively small, but it grew over time and came to number arguably several tens of thousands. That's a significant minority within the overall number of Yiddish daily newspaper readers, which reached an estimated total of about 500,000 at their peak in the 1920s. So we're talking about, again, a minority, I think a significant minority, both in terms of numbers and in their importance in the development of Jewish public life, and more specifically, the education and cultural development of immigrant Jews. The second point I want to make, besides defining who we're talking about in this category of the Yiddish, but the better Yiddish reader, is another point I want to make. It has to do with the ambivalent relationship with the mass between the community of better readers and the mass circulation Yiddish dailies, such as the Vorwärts and its competitors, or at least a number of its competitors. And that ambivalence consisted of this tension. On the one hand, the dailies gave rise to a mass Yiddish readership. There was no mass Yiddish readership in the United States until the emergence of dailies starting in the 1880s and then continuing through the 1890s. First, I should say, actually, mass Yiddish weeklies, then mass Yiddish dailies through the 1880s and 1890s. And so those newspapers were very, very important in forging a popular Yiddish readership where none existed before. And it was from that popular Yiddish readership that the better readers arose. So that's one thing. The other thing to note is that the Yiddish the popular press also employed a good number of intellectuals. So that's on the one hand. There's a certain degree of indebtedness on the part of the intellectuals and their audiences, their readers, to the popular Yiddish press. And on the other hand, they disliked the popular Yiddish press. They often criticized the popular Yiddish press for its alleged vulgarity, its crude language, its sensationalistic news coverage, its lowbrow entertaining features. All those things were said to corrupt the minds of readers. And so that Yiddish magazines often define themselves in opposition to the popular Yiddish press. So again, on the one hand, it defined the Yiddish magazines defined themselves against the popular Yiddish press, and to some degree really owed their existence to the popular Yiddish press. And in some instances, not only do they owe the audience to their audience to the success of the popular Yiddish press, but they also owned their financial existence to it, because in certain instances, popular Yiddish newspapers bankrolled Yiddish magazines, which otherwise struggled to stay afloat. So this ambivalent situation that I just described belied the very terms used by Yiddish-speaking intellectuals and their more devoted readers. While they spoke in terms of a clear hierarchies of basically highbrow, lowbrow, popular and serious, I'd argue that there actually was no hard divide between the Jewish masses and the elite, the intellectuals and the uneducated, the quote, better workers, and the ordinary everyday readers. All these types existed in relation to one another along a spectrum of education and sophistication, which is to say the better readers formed a relative type that shifted over time. So on the one hand, what I'm saying is that the terms aren't useless terms. The terms used by and created by the writers, the intellectual writers and their readers, those terms have to be qualified. They have to be defined and qualified as not existing in terms of rigid hierarchies or binaries, but again, relative terms that changed and shifted over time. I would say that the fact that the better readers existed at all is remarkable. The level and to appreciate this, to appreciate the importance of the sheer novelty of the emergence of a more sophisticated readership, it's important to understand that most immigrants to the United States didn't possess much in the way of formal schooling. Many immigrant Jews were illiterate or barely literate. Others had some decent level of literacy in some regards, but not the kind of literacy that was required to read the kind of publications I'm going to be talking about. So when one keeps that in mind, the cultivation and the emergence of a better readership was, as I say, really significant in as much as it showed important changes underway in the immigrant Jewish population. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the magazines themselves, and I divide the period of what I'm calling the birth of the Yiddish magazines into two sub-periods. The first one is actually fairly clearly delineated chronologically. It begins in the it's limited to the 1890s. And it pretty much comes to an end in 1900. And it's because in that decade of the 1890s that the first Yiddish magazines emerge. The first one begins in 1892, and almost all of them that start in the 1890s go out of business by 1900 for various reasons. The 1890s, I wouldn't say it's incidental that it's that decade that sees these magazines come into existence. This was a very tumultuous decade. It was a decade defined by periodic outbursts of labor conflict. There were huge strikes in 1890, in 1891, 1894, and in various years in between. It was really in immigrant Jewish areas of New York City, Chicago, and elsewhere. It was really a time of turmoil. It also was the decade in which the socialist movement really began to grow, and the socialist message very much included a drive to educate the workers as part of socialist propaganda. So in the context of class conflict, of the rise of the Jewish labor movement and the spread of socialist ideas, that the early Jewish magazines appeared. And I'll give you, and I'll just tell you the names of these magazines. There were 4, as far as I know. The first one was the Zukunft, or the future. The second one to come into, I'm just talking in terms of chronology. The second one was Der Neue Geist, that started in 1897. Die Freie Gesellschaft started also in 1897 in a magazine called Die Neue Zeit, the New Era, started in 1898. So the future, the new spirit, the free society, and the new era. Did I say that twice? The new spirit, the new free society, and the new era between starting in 1892, and all of them disappeared in 1890, although some of them would come back later. All these magazines weren't identical, but they shared certain characteristics. One is that they were all magazines of the political left. Die Zukunft was published by the Yiddish-speaking sections of the Socialist Labor Party, and it was a Marxist magazine. Same with Die Neue Zeit. Die Freie Gesellschaft was anarchist. It was published by a group of anarchists. And Der Neue Geist was formally independent. It was not published by any organization or political party. It was published by a private publisher. Its editor, however, Alexander Harkavi, the very important philologist, had strong anarchist leanings. So I would group it under the political left. So that's one thing all had in common. These were magazines of the political left. And they all sought in some degree to educate. That's also a shared characteristic of the early magazines, is their didacticism. They are all didactic magazines. They all had the major purpose, the primary purpose was to educate and uplift and develop class consciousness through general education. I said Die Zukunft was the first. It defined itself as a, quote, socialist scientific monthly, later changed its name to a monthly journal for science, literature, and socialism. And in the first issue of the magazine, it said in its statement of purpose that the magazine was published for the sake of, quote, serious workers who yearn to know and to become educated people. And I'll just read to you more from the statement so you can get a sense of its own identity as a magazine. The statement was written, I should mention, was written by a man named Philip Krantz, a Russian-born Jew who actually came from a fairly acculturated family. He didn't have a Jewish education to speak of. In fact, he didn't know Yiddish, or didn't know Yiddish well, until he moved to England, where he became a Yiddish editor. So he came from a fairly educated, Russified, very much a secular family. And he defined the mission of the magazine, at least in its first issue. And this is what he wrote, quote, the Zukunft is not a socialist organ in the narrow sense of the word, but a general educational journal. Not only do we want the Jewish worker to know how he's being robbed, economically oppressed, and politically swindled by this capitalist class, and what he should do to throw off the capitalist yoke, we all want him to understand fully how mankind arrived at its current stage, how it lived earlier, and how it is developed, end quote. So what Krantz was saying is that the reader won't, even though it's a Marxist magazine, the reader could expect to receive a general, widely focused, broad education. Not every issue would focus only on Karl Marx and his theories. And the idea here was that knowledge was power. Secular knowledge, of course. Knowledge was power. And as Krantz put it, it was, quote, a weapon in the struggle for a better future. End quote. So the idea was that the more workers knew, the more they could sharpen their class consciousness and learn about the workings of capitalism and the world more broadly, and then they would be more effective political actors. So that was the basic idea. The magazine's cover, at least in the first issue, illustrated these themes. On the left side of the magazine of the cover was a robed woman holding a torch and leaning on a tablet that stated in Yiddish, "Workers of the world unite." And then at her feet lie a stack of scholarly books, an array of scientific tools with the words "wisdom" and "labor conquers all" in Latin. And then in the background, there's a rising sun, which, like the name of the journal itself, projected a tremendous degree of optimism in the future, that there was a bright future, and this bright future was going to be built by the workers once they acquired knowledge, science, and so forth. The typical issue, I'm going to show you an issue of it in a moment, but the typical issue of the Zukunft began with a biographical sketch of an important thinker or revolutionary activist. And then the rest of the magazine, in any given magazine, would have articles on political theory, on political economy, and then the sciences, anthropology, biology, zoology, astronomy, physics, were all represented in the magazine. And then a little bit of literature, not a great deal, but a little bit of literature. And so you might see an article like The Rise of the Proletariat in America, or On the American Women's Movement, or God, Religion, and Morals, or Crime and Criminals, or The Development of Nations. So these are titles of typical articles. And one thing you might note here is that very, very rarely was any Jewish subject covered. The idea here was not to build up any kind of Jewish consciousness or develop Yiddish culture, which was a term that didn't exist yet in the 1890s, more on that later, but really to provide as much general knowledge to workers, as I say, so they might develop a class consciousness. And it was understood that as they became more educated, they would leave, drift away from, move away from not only religion, but any sense of Jewish group belonging. So again, the idea here is that once Jewish workers became more knowledgeable and secular, they would leave Judaism, they'd leave the Jewish community, and they'd simply be class conscious workers. So that's why there's almost no Jewish content in the Zukunft or any of the other magazines, with the exception of Der Neuer Geist. By 1897, the Zukunft could boast that it had published over the previous 5 years 2,100 pages of Wissenschaft, by which it meant learning based on science and scholarship. So that was something that was really quite remarkable, because this kind of material didn't exist before in Yiddish before the magazine was started. It was not clear at all. You know what I'm going to do, actually? I'm going to show you the magazine. What I have here, I'm not showing you PDFs because I didn't want to scan these, because I didn't want to damage. In fact, every time I open it, I simply do damage it. But I'm going to show you the cover of the Zukunft from 1897. This volume from 1897 belonged to the Arbeiterring, or Workmen's Circle, Mutual Aid Society for Jewish workers. And I know this because there's a stamp in it. This is a little bit different than the cover I described. The cover I described is from 1892, but you can still see it's similar. You have the tablets that say "Workers of the World Unite" in Yiddish. You've got the torch of freedom and knowledge. And there it is. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what was published in that year. Here is, in February 1897, the profile of the month was Karl Marx's daughter. There's a picture of her. So there's a biographical profile of her. There was a historical article in March on the Paris Commune. There is a history of the Constitution, the American Constitution and the American Revolution, an article called "What is Socialism?" and on and on. So this is what the Zukunft looked like. The typical issue is about 50 pages long. So there's a good number, I should mention, there's also translations. Now, I should also mention that a lot of this was, none of this was original. The typical writers simply read a history book or someone else's article somewhere else and summarized it in Yiddish for the readers. And this was called, in the Yiddish speaking sphere, this approach is called popularization, or popularizatia. And it was not, again, the purpose here was not to develop original ideas, but simply to impart knowledge developed by others, writing in German, French, English, Russian, whatever, to impart that in digestible form for Jewish workers who otherwise didn't have the benefit of formal schooling. Sometimes it was superficial. I'm sure there were mistakes, at least the critics of the Zukunft said over time that there were factual errors, and I have no reason to doubt that. Readers in Russia, I should mention here that the Zukunft was not only read in the United States, but it was read in Russia in the 1890s. It was smuggled into the Russian Empire by couriers who then circulated the magazine in the emerging Jewish revolutionary movement. And workers there would read these in groups. And according to one early Jewish revolutionary, well, he said that he and his Russian comrades, instead of calling it popularizatsiya, they called it watered down socialism, or Wasserizatsiya. They were poking fun of the writers in the Zukunft, who they thought really were not that knowledgeable. So this, again, I just want to give you a sense of kind of the contents. It was not original. It was not always even necessarily totally reliable, but nonetheless, as I say, this was new. The reader's response, how did the readers respond? The reader's response that I've been able to find is really extraordinary. The first issue, there were no letters to the editor. So unfortunately, I don't have those, for at least for the 1890s. But the secretary of the magazine quoted at length some letters later on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the Zukunft in 1912. And I'm going to read to you those letters, or at least two of them. So, or a portion of those, and this is the secretary writing in 1912. He said he received the following letter. Quote, we read that, and this is from a group of workers, he said, we read Die Zukunft and simply can't believe our own eyes. Is this possible that in the hated jargon, in the language of servant girls, such deep thoughts can be expressed plainly and simply so that the ignorant might be introduced to the highest science? This is the greatest undertaking you can set for yourself. We will do everything in our power to help you in your noble work, end quote. And here's another letter, again, written by a group of workers. And it says, and they wrote, quote, Die Zukunft is the only ray of light in our lives. We gather in a hall in the evening and somebody reads the learned articles out loud and we discuss them. The effect that the Zukunft has had on us is indescribable. Finally, we have the possibility to partake in forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge, end quote. And I know from oral histories, in interviews and memoirs with people who lived through that decade, that the magazine was often read in groups. There were Zukunft clubs that sprung up in different cities where groups of readers would do just as these letters describe. They read articles together. Someone would read it out loud. Others perhaps they'd read them on their own and then come together to discuss. But nonetheless, there were, whatever the case, the collective reading and discussion were very much part of the formation of the Zukunft's readership. And the groups, some of these groups were informal, some of them had names, and I'll just tell you some of the names to give you a feel for it. Well, I already mentioned one, and that was the Arbiter Ring, or the Workmen's Circle. There was a group called the Proletariat Society. There was the Karl Marx Association. There was the Young Education Society, the Young Friends Progressive Education Society, and there were dozens of others of these groups that sprang up, and they read the Zukunft. Sometimes you can see in old copies stamps of the groups that ordered these, like the one I just pointed out. Some of them had informal libraries, and they kept these libraries in people's apartments, and they saved these issues. So there was reading happened. Certainly this magazine reached the working class, and reading took place in a formal manner. One interesting thing that you wouldn't know from the magazine is that it seems that at least some workers, at least some people who were not workers or not even socialists, read it. In the memoirs of the most influential rabbi in the Lower East Side, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Masliansky, he talks about reading the Zukunft, not because he agreed with the political outlook, but because he thought the articles were so educational that he needed to read the magazine. And along those lines, one of the more conservative Yiddish newspapers, a weekly called the Yiddish Gazetten, actively promoted the Zukunft to its readers. And I'll read to you from the announcement. It said that the readers should, actually, again, it was an announcement from the newspaper. And it said the reader, that he described, the newspaper described the Zukunft as, quote, the only purely scientific journal in simple Yiddish. And the editor wrote, quote, everyone who loves education itself and wants the poor Jewish people to become more educated should support the Zukunft in its holy task by circulating it. And I should also mention that its most devoted readers often went door to door selling subscriptions. All in all, it seems, at least according to Zukunft, there was reached a peak circulation in the 1890s of 3,500 readers. Just to give you a sense of the scale, the most popular socialist weekly of the time probably hit about maybe 10,000 in its circulation. And perhaps the most popular daily was reached about 40,000 during the 1890s. So it was I would consider that a respectable circulation, but also I want to keep in mind, I also want to emphasize that it's hard to know exactly what the circulation is. First of all, we don't have hard evidence. And second, the magazine, as I pointed out, was read in groups. So that was the Zukunft. It was the first, probably the most successful, certainly the longest lasting of the early Yiddish magazines. I'll just mention another, I'll go back to another. This was Alexander Harkavy's Der Neuer Geist, which was independent. And that's why I want to mention it. Again, it was an independent magazine. It was nonpartisan. So it was a little bit different from the Zukunft. It did not put forward any political line. It was not wedded to Marxism or anarchism. It was nonpartisan, and that was intentional. Harkavy wrote that in the first issue, the editor, Alexander Harkavy, wrote that the program of Der Neuer Geist is a broad one, and he wrote, the journal, quote, makes an effort to understand a question from all sides. And so that was one difference. The other difference with the Zukunft is a slight difference in emphasis, and that is the Zukunft viewed knowledge in a lot of ways as instrumental. It was a weapon in the class struggle, where Der Neuer Geist stressed human cultivation, that it made one became a better human being by becoming educated. And I'll read to you from an 1898 editorial by Harkavy. He wrote, without cultivation and education, a person's spirit, understanding, and judgment remains as raw and wild as beasts in the field, end quote. So again, there was more of a sense for sort of education for its own sake and the cultivation. It too had readers. I don't know what the circulation was. I don't even have an estimate, but the letters to the editor are interesting because they suggest a broader range of readers and more educated. So to give you one example, a doctor from Brooklyn wrote in English that the Neuer Geist is, quote, the most artful and also the best Jewish journal ever published in this or any other country. A self-described worker from Haverhill, Massachusetts, described it as a welcome guest in his home. A tailor in Cincinnati composed a poem in honor of the magazine. And another reader in Cincinnati, described by the editor as a, quote, a conservative Hebraist, also sent in a poem, expressing congratulations and good wishes. I'll give you just one more example. There was a group in Chicago that called itself the Classic Literary Society. And they also wrote a letter of congratulations. Actually, just one more. And that is someone identified as an Orthodox editor also praised it as the best new magazine, which was beloved in his home. So again, there's a range of readers according to the letters to the editor. So this is the 1890s. I said all the magazines went under, and they did for various reasons. One has to, for some they didn't have time, for others, the editor didn't have enough money. In the case of Der Neuer, the Freie Gesellschaft, the anarchist magazine, it was said that the editor was Sholyanovsky was so difficult to get along with, people just didn't want to work with him. In the case of Die Zukunft, it went out of business because of a political factional struggle in the Socialist Labor Party that destroyed the party, and the magazine went down with it. So it doesn't seem to have gone out of business for lack of readers, but for political reasons. All right, so that was the 1890s. The second period was roughly around 1904, 1905 to World War I. And that saw a new crop of Yiddish magazines. And those magazines were actually quite a bit different from the didactic magazines of the 1890s. These magazines did not exist to provide a basic education to the readers, to newly radicalized readers or just readers who were seeking some introduction to knowledge. The magazines that came out in the first decade or so of the 20th century already presumed the readers, the better readers, the more serious readers already had some education, either because they came to the United States with more education or whatever, somehow acquired more education. So that the serious readers, the better readers they wished to reach did not need rudimentary instruction. And indeed, there were some of these magazines that counted intellectuals as the primary audience. These new magazines of the 1900s, early 1900s, were dedicated, almost all of them, to the advancement of Yiddish letters, fiction, poetry, theater, drama, Yiddish criticism. All of them were interested on some level or another in Jewish communal concerns. So in other words, these magazines are more Jewish. And they mix this in with contemporary discussion of contemporary social and political and economic issues. So these new magazines then tended to be more sophisticated. They were more Jewish oriented. Indeed, many of them were cultural. Many of them were outspoken national. The editors were outspoken nationalists, and they were more culturally oriented than their predecessors, meaning that they had a balance of culture, contemporary social, political, and economic issues, and Jewish communal issues, often at the one and the same time. The titles were, to give you some examples of titles, there was Das Neue Land, the masthead described it as an illustrated weekly for literature, art, criticism, and culture. There was the Yiddische Wochenschrift, the Yiddish Weekly, which was described itself as a magazine dedicated to Yiddish literature and Jewish national and nationalist issues. There was Literatur und Leben, Literature and Life, a magazine that said in its founding statement that through the journal, quote, "We want to contribute to the great difficult task of spiritual and cultural development of the Jewish reader. We believe in the better Yiddish reader, in the reader with cultural aspirations and ideals of spiritual fulfillment," end quote. These were some of the magazines, and I'm going to show you them, or at least some examples of them. Again, I didn't want to create PDFs. This is Das Neue Land. This was edited by Avram Rezen, very popular Yiddish poet, and one of the more accomplished. And you can see already the format's different. It's illustrated, and a lot of the articles. Well, actually, what I'll do is just give you some examples of articles. In Das Neue Land, there were articles like "Are Intellectuals and Yiddish Literature," the Yiddish Press in America and Russia, the Yiddish Writer in American Exile. So those were some of the articles that ran. In the Yiddische Wochenschrift, which I'm not going to show you, there were articles like "The Three Foundations of Yud Lamed Peretz's Creative Work," Jewish National Art and National Artists, Illiteracy Among Immigrant Jews and Other Immigrant Groups. These were articles on the Jewish side. And then more general interest articles were, so for instance, the recent coal miners' strike or anti-Semitism in America. Literatur und Leben had articles like "The Jewish People and the Jewish God," "The Crisis of Growth in the Jewish Labor Movement," "The Yiddish Language, Its Literature, Its Writers and Readers," "In the American Theater," and "The American Drama." All of these, you can tell, gave great space to Yiddish culture. I'm going to give you just a few more. I'll just show you a few more examples. This one is not so great to look at, but why not? This is Literatur und Leben. And I think what's really interesting about this magazine is that it was a truly transnational magazine in that it was published in a single issue. There was Literatur und Leben and a journal from Vilna called the Yiddische Welt. And every issue of the magazine simply reprinted. It didn't even reprint. It actually bound together one magazine and the other. under one cover. So it was a truly transnational magazine. And it really created a dialogue between writers and readers on both sides of the Atlantic. Here's another. This is the revived version of Die Freie Gesellschaft, the anarchist magazine. This belonged to someone who lived on Bushwick Avenue in Brooklyn named Edelstein. And you could see this is an issue from 1910. And unlike the earlier unlike the original version, this was not a didactic magazine, but gave much more attention to culture and contemporary issues. This here is a portrait honoring the great German anarchist Johann Most, who had recently passed away. I'm going to show you one other magazine that I haven't, of a type I haven't mentioned, but it should be mentioned, so you get a sense of the range of new periodicals. And this is something from 1910, and it's simply called Literatur. And this was dedicated entirely to fiction, poetry, and criticism, nothing to do with social and political issues. This arose out of the literary circle known as Die Junge, which sought to separate Yiddish literature from politics and contemporary events. It's published by someone named Max Michels, who was a Yiddish book publisher dedicated to well, a better sort of book, a lot of literature and serious works of one kind or another. He published this. In fact, he published the other one, Literatur and Leben. So that one was called Literature and Life. This is just called Literature. And again, it made a statement. It's expensive. This was a 30-cent journal. It has the Russian price here, and this didn't last very long. But again, I want to give you an example of, I want to show you this because it represents the emergence of purely literary forums, miscellany, quarterlies, monthlies that didn't last more than a month, various sorts of small scale venues that were made by writers and poets for themselves. They were the main audience for what they were putting out. All right, so these are examples of some of the new magazines that were coming out. Now, why did this happen? It came out, these kinds of magazines, I'd argue, emerged for several reasons. One, readers had developed over the years. They had become more educated, more sophisticated. So there was a stratum of better readers that had developed over the course of some 2 decades by this point. Also, there was a surge in immigrants in the first decade of the 20th century. And a good number of those immigrants were better educated. After 1903, there was more than 100,000 immigrants a year coming to the United States, and that boosted the audience for these kinds of magazines. And then finally, and arguably most importantly, was the emergence of new ideologies, Jewish nationalist ideologies, or ideologies that sought to synthesize revolutionary socialism with some form of Jewish nationalism, whether that was Zionism or territorialism or the Bund. All were dedicated to some sort of synthesis, some sort of class nation synthesis, and all were also committed to the development of Yiddish culture. And in fact, it's in this decade, the first decade of the 20th century, that the term Yiddish culture comes into existence. And the term, as I said, wasn't used before. No one who put out the Zukunft, for instance, in the 1890s, thought they were building Yiddish culture. They thought they were simply educating workers using the Yiddish language. This new idea comes into circulation in the first decade of the 20th century that said there is a Yiddish culture. It's something that's stable, it's autonomous, and will be the future of Jewish culture. They expected that, a future of American Jewish culture. They expected that American Jews would speak Yiddish, or they hoped would speak Yiddish permanently, and they hoped to create as I say, an autonomous, developed, high-level culture in the Yiddish language. And this is the reason why all these new magazines focus so much on culture. It was this idea coming out of Jewish nationalism that the liberation of the Jewish nation and of the worker had to go hand in hand with a cultural renaissance. And Yiddish was seen as basically sort of the partner, the equal partner, what's the right word here? Yiddish was seen as part and parcel of national liberation. The most important exponent of this view of Yiddish culture, of national liberation and regeneration, and coupled with socialism, was a magazine called Dosnaya Leben, which appeared in 1908 under the editorship of Chaim Zhitlovsky, who was the foremost theoretician of the Yiddish cultural renaissance of the kind I'm describing. Dosnaya Leben was a part of the larger trend I'm describing. In fact, it had helped inspire a whole array of Yiddish magazines, including the ones I just mentioned, but it stood in a class by itself because the magazine was not intended for a large audience. It was intended for intellectuals. It wanted to forge a nationalist Jewish intelligentsia that would be committed to serving the public, to serving the masses, to serving the workers. But again, the purpose of the magazine was not to reach even the reader of the Zukunft necessarily. This was a very difficult magazine that occupied itself with philosophical matters, original research, very long articles, serialized, were common to see in Dosnaya Leben. So in Dosnaya Leben, you would read articles with titles like Materialism and Dialectical Logic, or Social Monism, or Moral Philosophy and the End Goal. Right? Very abstruse titles that even the better reader, according to the standards of the time, couldn't really approach it easily. And then in addition to those very difficult and weighty works, often written by Zhitlovsky himself, there were articles on Jewish topics that having to do with his theory of Jewish nationalism. So for instance, one of his most famous pieces was called The National Poetic Rebirth of the Jewish Religion, which posited a transformation of Judaism from the secular transformation of Judaism. And that was meant for intellectuals who wanted to practice some kind of Judaism, but not do it, not tie it to belief in God. So that was Dosnaya Leben. I actually brought a couple of issues of those as well. This is one from the 1920s. The magazine stopped in 1914 and was revived. This is how it looked in the 1920s. Again, it wasn't especially beautiful. There weren't illustrations. What you got was serious essays for the most part. Now, I'll just say that this magazine sparked a lot of controversy. It actually angered a fair number of people, including a lot of intellectuals, especially of the old guard, such as Abraham Kahan, who edited the Zukunft for a number of years, and by 1908, edited the Vorwärts. And he actually published articles criticizing this magazine, saying that the magazine was pointless and elitist. According to Kahan, the problem with this magazine is it was catered to an intellectual aristocracy, the handful of people that grouped around Zhitlovsky, but no one else. Who could read a magazine like this, he said? Who could understand the language? Who had time to read it? This was entirely pointless, and according to Abraham Kahn. And he said the purpose of the intellectual was not to create this kind of aristocracy, but to do what he and his colleagues from the 1890s were doing all along, which was introducing workers to the basics of Western knowledge with the expectation that they would eventually continue on in a journey that would take them beyond Yiddish and beyond the Jewish community. And Zhitlovsky thought this was just the problem. He hated the assimilationist underpinning of Kahn's critique. He thought Kahn anyway was an ignoramus, and he responded quite vehemently by saying that Kahn simply didn't understand the purpose of Dosnaya Leben, which was to create an intellectual, a more developed intelligentsia that would serve the workers, the more popular audience, so they wouldn't have to make a choice in their lives between English and Yiddish, between assimilation and Jewish identity. So there was this controversy about this magazine, but not only that magazine, but especially Das 9/11. And the controversy, as I say, hinged on ultimately the whole future of Jews in America. What should they be? How should they be Americanized? Should they assimilate or not? Should they give up religion? Give up the language or not, all right? So the whole question of this 9/11 sparked a much larger debate that spilled over into many of the magazines I'm talking about during this period. It was really a time where the question of assimilation was burning. And for the editors of these magazines, the answer was usually no, we don't want to assimilate. We want to maintain the Yiddish, we want to develop the Yiddish culture. We want to remain as a people in the United States. Kahan, in a sense, was right about the small number of readers, but not as right as he supposed. According to Das 9/11 itself, there were about 1,000 subscribers. They started with 50 in 1908, and according to the editor, it grew to 1,000 by 1909, with about a circulation of about 3,000. The readers actually were also a little bit more diverse than the intellectual aristocracy that Abraham Kahan claimed. And I know this in part by digging into the Chaim Shetlovsky's archives at the YIVO Institute. And I found a number of handwritten letters, personal letters that were never published to Shetlovsky. And it gave me a sense of who read this magazine. So one letter was from a farmhand in Concord, Massachusetts, very unusual. And he confessed to Shetlovsky, he said, look, as he put it, I feel a little bit like an intellectual inside. And he really enjoyed reading the magazine. I found a letter by a fruit and vegetable wholesaler in Los Angeles. He ordered 10 copies of the magazine. One of my favorite letters was from a man in Chattanooga, Tennessee, who said that one of Shetlovsky's articles, it was called Yid und Mensch, one of his most famous essays, meaning Jew and man. It was an article saying you can be fully, as an essay that argued, one can be fully a Jew and not sacrifice any larger sense of belonging to humanity. And he said not only that the more you identify as a Jew, the more humane, humanistic, and universalistic you are in your outlook. And this was an incredibly powerful essay. And according to the man in Chattanooga, that essay, quote, "has taken our town by storm." One of my favorite letters came from a self-described worker on the Lower East Side who saw an announcement for Shetlovsky's collected works in the Yiddish Wochenschrift that I referred to a few moments ago. The Yiddish Wochenschrift was advertising Shetlovsky's collected works. This worker sent away for it. And he did for his younger brother. He said, as a worker, I don't have time to subscribe to magazines. Clearly he read them, but he said, I don't have this time to subscribe to them, but my 14-year-old younger brother really does. So I'm subscribing to Das 9/11, he said. I want Shetlovsky's collected works. He subscribed to Yiddish Wochenschrift, but it closed down. So that's just another example of a worker who wanted this magazine. And then there were Das 9/11 clubs, including one in Atlanta, Georgia, but also in places you'd expect like Chicago and New York. And then finally, the final example of readers and supporters of Das 9/11, and that was in Omaha, Nebraska, of all places, where a group calling itself the Jewish National Radical Club formed to read the magazine, to spread Yiddish literature and art, to, quote, combat the slavish spirit of assimilation, and to, quote, revive the will and consciousness of Jewish liberation, all in Omaha, Nebraska. I'm going to wrap it up by just saying that the final magazine, I'll wrap it up by returning to Die Zukunft, which, as I said, went out of business, but then returned in 1902. And then in 1912, was transformed into a general interest magazine dedicated to the subjects we've been discussing. And it was able to do this. It was able to hire an editor, to pay an editorial staff, to put it out regularly on a monthly basis with a very nice illustrated cover every issue. And that's because the forward bankrolled it. Starting in 1913, the forward was very, very popular. It was the most popular Yiddish newspaper. It was highly profitable, and used the profits of sales and subscriptions and advertising to start bankrolling the Zukunft. That magazine became the single most popular Yiddish magazine of the whole immigrant period, with an estimated readership of, by at least estimated by the editor, the poet Avram Liesen, with a subscription of a circulation of 17,000 by 1913. Liesen estimated that the actual number of readers surpassed 50,000, which could in fact be true. But it was in Die Zukunft that you Die symbiotic relationship between the popular press and the more advanced Yiddish magazines of the period. Die Zukunft was the most successful magazine, and it could not have achieved that success without the profits of the Vorwärts, which many readers and writers of the Zukunft criticized all the time and vehemently for being too lowbrow. So I'll just conclude then by saying that this, but the Zukunft shows is the significance of sponsorship, the need for in the Yiddish sphere, and the need for an individual, or in this case, a newspaper, to fund it. And that's because the immigrant Jewish population was fairly small. The number of readers educated readers was limited. But at the same time, I wouldn't want to place too much emphasis on it. And for the sake of comparison, I just mentioned that even to this day, the most successful English language magazines like Harper's or the New Republic operate at a loss, and there's no expectation that they turn a profit, and they're subsidized typically by wealthy individuals. So the Zukunft shows, on the one hand, the achievements of the Yiddish of the Yiddish press, also its limitations, but its limitations weren't necessarily limited or unique to the Yiddish-speaking sphere. But you could see as something in common, Yiddish magazines had, even with the American press of its time or even our own time. And I'm just going to cut it off there because I've gone on a long time, and I think there's time for questions.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's been a pleasure to listen to you. We have a couple of questions already in the box, but anyone who would like to ask a question should please use the Q&A feature down at the bottom, and you can type in a question and I will read it. Before, just give you a minute to do that, I want to just make an announcement that I wish to thank the Department of Religion and the Department of German Studies, both of whom are co-sponsors of this event. And I also want to take the chance to thank our staff members, Paul Entis and Danielle Petrone, for everything they did to make this program possible. Okay, so we have a couple of questions here. First of all, Catherine Hellerstein is in the audience, professor from University of Pennsylvania. She's asking a specific question about who illustrated the cover of Das Neue Land that you showed.
Let me see. Let me just see if I can find that. Hold on a moment. Zuni Mod illustrated it. If I can read it right, it's very tiny, but I think it's Zuni Mod. That's what I believe.
Do you know anything about that illustrator, or?
Eddie Portnoy, who is part of the symposium, is the expert in Zuni Mod and Zuni Mod studies. But he was part of this new crop of intellectuals that I'm describing, who are really committed to the advancement of Yiddish literature, and he was associated with he was associated with the new Yiddish culturalists, and then went over to the world of the kind of the pro-communist Yiddish left, if I'm not mistaken.
Professor Hellerstein says Zuni Mod was a great artist connected with Die Junge. Okay. Miriam Udell has not a question, but a comment. She says she's swooning over the font of literature. All this raises a larger question, which is that there was a graphic element to magazines, which is a little different than newspapers. And that, for example, the illustration that you showed with the Zukunft, and perhaps you could say a little bit more about the importance of that those aren't just kind of, that things even like a font can evoke certain ideas or principles that were associated with the programs of these journals.
It's a great question. I haven't thought enough about the visual aspect to this, in part because I know so little about the visual arts. But I think you're right about this, that the stylized font, the stylized mastheads, I think made a statement. I think they were intended to make a statement, again, about the artistic possibilities of Yiddish. That it was beautiful, that it was meant to be beautiful, just like the literature they were putting out was meant to be beautiful. And I'll just give you a few more examples of this. So this is from a later period. This is In Sich, the modernist poetry magazine, primarily associated with the introspectivists, the Inzichisten. I would say this is the closest thing in Yiddish to a partisan review at the time. And you could see, again, you can see the font. This is not a font that screams out "buy me." I mean, at least to the average reader, because the average reader would have to stand there and try to figure out what it says for a moment and then keep walking if they saw it in a newsstand. So I'll give you a couple of others examples. This is from the 30s, by the way. This is one I love. This is Chicago. This is also, is it from the 30s? From the 1935. This is Chicago. And this was also almost an exclusively literary cultural magazine that really was intended to put Chicago on the map as a Yiddish literary center. And again, the font is terrific. And then finally, which I think also makes its own statement, is this magazine, simply called Yiddish. And here, in addition to the stylized font, the fact that it's called Yiddish is kind of like, it makes a similar statement to literatur. It's saying, this is what we stand for. It's just Yiddish. Yiddish has its own worth. It's nothing more needs to be said. We stand for Yiddish. There's no subtitle. There's no purpose beyond Yiddish is its own justification, is what I'm trying to say. And I think it's the same with all these magazines. And I think the font says that, again, it stands for beauty, for aestheticism, for literature as its own, literature and art, Yiddish creativity as its own autonomous sphere, not dependent on a political party, not dependent on any instrumental purpose. Underneath it, I would say, for many of these magazines, there is a kind of nationalism, but the nationalism doesn't come out in political terms. It comes out in its affirmation of Yiddish culture.
Very good. Okay, Annie Pollinet raises a question of, especially because you showed the article on Eleanor Marx and whether women were particularly cultivated as readers of magazines and whether there was any difference in the Yiddish press, in the daily and weekly press, which sometimes had women's features, women's columns, and whether there was any, what was the place of women in these intellectual circles that were reading magazines and journals?
So in the case, if you're talking about the contents of the magazines, so there's two questions there, I think. There's contents and readers. The contents, I gave two examples of the Zukunft paying attention to women, both in terms of profiling them, case of Marx, Eleanor Marx, but there were other examples, and in articles about women, so the so-called women's question, or articles on suffrage. You see these articles in these magazines. There were some over time, in the 1890s, there were no women writing, well, I don't know. There were virtually no women. There might've been one or two who wrote for these magazines in the 1890s. The one person I'm thinking of is a woman named Anna Ingerman, who was a dentist by profession and one of the first Russian social democrats, meaning Marxists from that time. But really, you don't start to see women contributors to these magazines, I would say, until the second decade of the 20th century, and then more increasing numbers after that. As far as readers go, okay, the clearest example that women were part of the readership of these more advanced magazines of the 19-teens, 20s, 30s that I referred to a moment ago was there were two important pieces of evidence. One is they're all women reading groups that formed by the 1930s, if not sooner. So that's just one very clear sign. They're all women reading groups, tended to be associated with one or another political party, or Yiddish cultural organizations attached to political parties. So that's the most obvious example. But there are also many integrated co-ed, if you will, reading groups too. So if you look at, you could look at the membership lists of reading groups in places like Chicago and Detroit, and you'll see men and women listed in the same group, or you'll see all women reading groups. So that's certainly true by the 1930s, but there's also anecdotal or let's say partial and occasional evidence suggests already this was true. I'll give you one more example, Annie. There was a group called the Socialist Literary Society that started in the 1900s. And at first that was an all male group. But according to Pauline Newman's oral history, she insists, Pauline Newman was an important labor organizer with the ILGWU, International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And she insisted, along with her friends, that it include women, and it did. And that's already by 1910. So yes, women are becoming active participants in the Yiddish cultural, literary, intellectual scene by then, by 1910, if not sooner.
Here's a question from Laura Eckstein. She's asking about whether you can trace any influence, or she calls it a genealogy, a similar, kind of a connection, a genealogical connection with the American Jewish press. And for example, is there any awareness at all of American Jewish periodicals like Isaac Leeser's The Occident or anything like that?
Any parallels? Well, as far as content goes, I don't think they're reprinting anything that I could tell. As far as parallels in terms of format and content,
but do you think they're even aware of the existence of Anglo-Jewish periodicals of the time?
They're absolutely.
He's mentioning like Isaac Mayer Wise as the Israelite, but I would also think of the American Hebrew or any kind of New York Jewish journals.
There's no question they're aware of it. I mean, first of all, a lot of these writers and readers read a lot. I mean, they're reading in multiple languages. They're reading English, they're reading German, some are reading Hebrew, some are reading Russian. So they're reading all sorts of things. And I'll just give you an example of, well, sometimes there's reference to the Anglo-Jewish press. I don't think it's ever kind reference from as I recall, but I'll give you one example I do recall clearly. And this is from the late 1880s, where a Reform rabbi in Boston had made some disparaging remarks in a local Jewish paper. And one of the leading anarchist activists in Yiddish writers and anarchist activists wrote a rebuttal, really an angry rebuttal, because the writer had said something like, Yiddish is the rabbi said something like Yiddish isn't, a language for the ignorant immigrants. And so he blasted him, saying, clearly you don't know Yiddish, because if you did, you look at the Yiddish press and you know this isn't true. And so that's one example. But again, I can't give you more specific examples, but I certainly recall reading in memoirs of writers and editors some awareness of American Jewish newspapers. But again, they didn't praise them. They just more kind of expressed an awareness that they existed.
Itchy Biederman asks, can you describe the philosophical nature of Zhidlovsky's social monism and how it pertains to the Jews?
Social monism. I don't know. I don't actually quite exactly know what social monism is. So I don't think I can answer that question. I could tell you though, that I believe it's related to his idea that that history moves not like the Marxists say in terms of class struggle, but is moved according to or driven forward by idealism, that ideas move history. And he called himself an historical idealist, and his monism has to do with that. I just can't tell you exactly how because I'm not a philosopher.
Very good.
But I appreciate the question.
Maybe to wrap up, there are two questions somewhat posed in somewhat opposite fashion, which might give some indication as to the nature of Yiddish in our culture. These are questions kind of about the era after Yiddish was a vibrant language, a spoken language in the United States. So on the one hand, Frida Pascal asked, do you feel that there is now a resurgence in interest in Yiddish? But then alongside that, Lillian Baxter says, so what happened that so few people now speak Yiddish or know its history, writers, or artists? So how do you kind of square both the fact that all of this went away so dramatically after such a vibrant existence, but then on the other hand, there seems to maybe be a renaissance in Yiddish studies?
Well, so the interwar period, to get at this question, I'll say that the interwar period from the 20s to the 40s or so, you see two things happening in the more advanced sphere of Yiddish letters. On the one hand, it's becoming more sophisticated, and you can see this through the diversity and contents of Yiddish magazines of the time. They keep publishing, and Yiddish magazines keep appearing, and the literature, the poetry, the level of criticism, the level of cultural history that's published in these magazines gets more original and more advanced. And at the same time, there is a shrinkage of the Yiddish readership that sets in, I would say, in the 1930s. And so why does that happen? So why does Yiddish culture develop? Why does it continue to develop even as the readership shrinks? I think it has to do with the fact that you don't have ongoing large influx of immigrants because Congress closed off immigration in 1924. That's part of it. Later, of course, the Holocaust devastates. That doesn't need any comment, I think, the Holocaust. And then you have pressures on not just the immigrants, but their children to give up Yiddish. The pressures on immigrants and their children to assimilate are really enormous during this time period. So you really have to want to maintain Yiddish in the way Zhitlovsky and his followers and his associates wanted to maintain Yiddish to keep it going. And they were committed to that, even as an increasing number of American Jews left it well, first of all, as immigration was declining and American-born, American-educated English-speaking Jews were increasing. So demographics had a lot to do with this. Starting in the late 40s, there is an interest in Yiddish culture among American Jews that actually becomes quite significant, although most don't learn Yiddish. But there is a kind of countercurrent among American Jews. And then later, I'd say after the 60s, a very small number of Yiddishists and academics who go into Jewish studies, like some people I know, start learning Yiddish and become interested in that way. And of course, finally, and maybe most importantly, is the natural birth rate of Hasidim, who were growing in numbers exponentially and committed, utterly committed to maintaining Yiddish. So that Yiddish today is actually going through a new flowering, and that includes in its print culture. I mean, the number of Yiddish magazines and newspapers today published in the United States is really impressive. And I will just say as a final example of this is a newish magazine called Wecker, which is dedicated to a whole array of secular subjects, not unlike what the Zukunft and Freie Gesellschaft and the others were trying to do a long time ago. There are differences, but I think there's some interesting similarities. So Yiddish is undergoing a kind of unexpected growth because of the Hasidic community and a willingness of some members in it to continue to kind of push the boundaries of what is acceptable expression in the Yiddish language. So Yiddish has, the decline of Yiddish, I suppose I'll just say, put it this way, the decline of Yiddish is not linear, or the development of Yiddish is not linear. It's grown, it's contracted, it's developed at a higher and higher level, it's developed in a popular level. The popular, sort of more vulgar aspects of Yiddish declined, even as the artistic use of Yiddish increased, and the Hasidim have come back. So the story of Yiddish in this country isn't a simple or linear story.
Great. Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for this fascinating journey through this cultural history. I think we've all learned a lot, and we thank you for sharing it with us. I want to remind everybody to check out our webpage at js.emory.edu. Our next big event will be February 22nd with the annual Tenenbaum lecture featuring Professor David Fishman, who's going to speak about the treasures that have survived from in Vilna that were smuggled and hidden during the Holocaust. And you can get all the information on our website, again, js.emory.edu. Thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Professor Michels, and we look forward to seeing you at the next program.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you for coming.